Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. We are going to try and start on time. Quite a lot of things to discuss and talk about today on this webinar. Most notably, the sheer volume of hacks and scams that we've seen since we started collecting this data. I'm Nick Smart. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer at Crystal. I've been with Crystal now for about 4 years, and in that time, I've seen a lot of changes and things happen in cryptocurrency in terms of hacks and scams. I'm joined today with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Andrii Sovershennyi. Andrii, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrii. I'm Research and Professional Standards Lead in Crystal team. As for now, I'm responsible for supporting our customers who lost their funds and assisting them to recover them. And yeah, I joined Crystal almost 7 years ago. And for now, yeah, I'm responsible for the customers' issues with crypto sets. Thank you.
So, for those of us just joining now, when we were discussing this particular webinar amongst the team, one of the things that we were really trying to understand is do these numbers mean anything anymore? Is providing overviews and trends in terms of crypto crime and huge numbers year on year on year, do they still add anything to the discussion? And do they still have some relevance to the marketplaces? We know lots of things have happened and lots of things have changed. And this year, of course, we'll have to talk about Bybit as a fairly large example in the case. But certainly something that we are trying to understand more of the team now is, does understanding the scale of the problem in value really give us any answers to it? Just so you're aware too, this is a bit of an interactive session. We'd welcome any questions you do put in the chat. We will try and answer them as we can. So please feel free to ask questions inside there of us if there's anything specific you'd like to know about. Another thing too is we will be running several polls throughout the session. The questions, we really welcome your responses because they help us understand, one, what's useful for you, but two, maybe inform our opinions on whether or not what we're seeing is what everyone else is seeing in the market too, and maybe give us some ideas on that. So without further ado, then let's go to the first poll if we can, please. And the question in the poll is, should regulators or are regulators doing enough to combat cryptocurrency thefts? And I always like to make it a regulator's problem because I think that's what we tend to do in a lot of things. But a general question, do we think that regulators are doing enough to combat cryptocurrency thefts? Whilst you're sort of like chewing on that one a little bit, let's just go through the sort of like the high level summary of the data that we've seen over the past year or so. So we started creating records on this since 2011. Total losses so far are $21.3 billion, which is an insane amount of money in just 1,000 incidents. The highest year being 2022, despite there being some notably higher value individual attacks. Incidents typically have, well, at least in our perspective, appeared to have fallen, which is pretty good. I would add on this data that there are some pretty big unknowns, particularly for fraud. We don't have the full picture, and it's very, very difficult to get the full picture and how much money has been stolen or defrauded from people, because some of it goes unreported and some of it just literally just doesn't appear. So whereas the incidence is a little bit more clear when it's been a theft, when it comes to a fraud, there is a significant gap in data, which again, the figure may be significantly higher. We just don't know. I think, though, as I mentioned at the outset of this session, was, do these numbers still mean anything? Does it help us to know how much money was lost in a year? Knowing that the number of incidents has gone down, but perhaps has become more high value, is indicative of improved security posture, particularly for theft. But Andrew, where do you come from on this? Like, what do you think? Do you think this data is any use to us anymore, really?
Yes and no. In terms of stats, it might be really interesting to get this information about the number of incidents that happened, the amount of total loss, and so on and so forth. But actually, it might basically show the trend. It might show that some law enforcement should keep an eye on the cases like that. They should be prepared for cryptocurrency cases and related stuff, and just be aware that crypto sales are growing as for now. But in general, as far as I'm aware, even the Bybit case doesn't even affect the price of the crypto market, doesn't affect the users' attitude and so on and so forth. So like nothing in particular changes, with the case of size like Bybit with
Mm,
over $1.5 billion. So as
yeah.
for now, like stats might change, but nothing in particular changes in terms of investigation in the market right now.
And I'd say too, we're still in September. There's always a chance of a very busy winter period. And I think another thing that we've struggled to understand is, or there's poor data on, is how much money has been recovered from this amounts that have been taken. And notably, lots more has been taken. Again, anecdotally, lots more has been taken than has been able to be returned to its rightful owners. So moving through the data a bit more then. So in terms of the attack types, fraud still remains like the most common. Data breaches or thefts are still pretty common as well, like making up over sort of collectively over 75-80% of everything. And as you noticed, although in some incidents have been significantly high value, amid drops in years, like probably coincidental with the price of cryptocurrencies, this year the average loss has been brought up, particularly for the Bybit as an outlier. So let's look at this year specifically then. And what we've done is we've overlaid the incidents from last year and this year together in terms of the values and then the amount of loss total per month. And you can see there's some pretty big sort of activities there. Notably, on all of these, the majority of these cases are involving the nation state affiliated group, the Lazarus group. So you have WazirX, DMM, BTC Turk, Bybit, obviously. There's lots and lots of these big things. Andrew, what do you make of this sort of like trend in terms of going after bigger exchanges rather than going for lots and lots of people? Notably, I'm sure many of our listeners will be aware of the security vulnerability that was uncovered in a compromised package in JavaScript, NPM. What do you notice about this? Is it that the attackers are going for like bigger fish these days and spending less time on going for kind of the everyone's a target business model? What's your kind of perspective on this?
I believe they usually attracted the Lazarus group attracted by the liquidity of the possible victims. They don't hesitate to take a couple of millions if it is possible in a short-term period of time. But in the Bybit case, as far as I am aware, they injected the malicious code like 2 weeks before the actual attack. So they've been waiting, they've been prepared. I also heard rumors that they even conducted a couple of test transactions and gained access to the funds of other users, but they haven't moved at all just because they've been waiting for the high profile fish such as Bybit.
Okay. So I guess that question then, like, let's see the next poll question, which is, are exchanges taking this seriously enough? Like, are they taking the risks of theft seriously enough in current sort of times? But yeah, I think that's another big one we could sort of discuss and talk about. Okay, so in contrast then of all time, we obviously have the plus token being amongst the still perhaps the most valuable crypto currently scam of all time, and Thodex not far behind it. But in a single fell swoop, Bybit really reset the book on thefts and the amount of money that could be taken. If we can finish the poll, please, and we'll have a look at the results. That's interesting. So a bit of a split really in terms of the voting, but many of you are sort of thinking that exchanges aren't taking it seriously enough in terms of risk. Andrew, what's your view on this? Do you think exchanges are taking this seriously?
Yes, they're trying their best. They spend lots of money on their security systems and they do the best practices that are currently available on the market. They use the multi-sig wallets, cold storages that are kept offline from their main infrastructure in the system. But again, bad actors are not sleeping as well. They evolve day by day and they use the most modern technologies that are available right now. And the cases like Bybit, like the WazirX, they've shown that even the most advanced security technologies might be weak against the sophisticated attack. And the
Yeah,
question is, what is possible to do right now to be sure that you're safe?
yeah, I think so. And I think it's really tricky to understand like whether or not they take the risks seriously. I think it's more difficult to pin it down when it comes to fraud, but I think certainly for like security of funds, I think they've got a lot more sophisticated on the security side than they have been, since we started looking at this data in 2011. Like, and I think that's noticeable by, the fall in the number of incidents. But when it does go wrong, like it goes really wrong, like there's lots of more to go ahead from it. So I think that they are taking more notice of it now, but there are other things that come onto that. And if we can bring up to the next poll, please, which is not just about the exchange's ability to protect itself from attack, but have they got better at handling incidents? And I think this is a really, really big discussion. If we look at this timeline, so I'll go back a slide. If we look at this timeline and we see, from January 2024 to February 2025, we had a number of like other attacks that took place in that year period. But the change in communication strategies and other things like that has been marked. But is this a general trend? Like, or we do have like one or two shining examples where, exchanges have handled things significantly better than others. Andrew, what's your sort of perspective or take on this? Like, do you think exchanges and their instant response has improved?
I can speak about one of the brightest examples that just happened this year with the Ben and the Bybit case, who became really public right after the incident happened. He didn't conceal any information from the case. He just started the stream and spoke from actually like the case perspective, like what happened, what was the loss, what was the reason. They started the immediate investigation. They even launched the public API to share the information about the case, so every player on the market could label addresses related to this case. And they opened the bounty program for everyone to attend. So yeah, it was a really bright example how it should be done. Unfortunately, in this particular case, Bybit team did not succeed a lot. Most of the funds, according to the website, became dark. So there is no information apparently from the investigator's perspective what happened with the funds, and there are really low chances for them. But yeah, the attitude, the appearance on the public was a really good example.
Yeah, I tend to agree as well. And I think a big driver for that is a lot more support from regulators and more of a less of a witch hunt sort of situation, and like you guys are negligent and incompetent, more to you've done everything you can, and it still happened to you. And I think there's been a lot more like improvements in the overall relationship between those two parties, which has assisted in like incident response massively. But I think it's quite an interesting contrast that many of our respondents said that they don't take it seriously enough, but also at the same time, they think they've got a lot better at handling incidents. So it's almost like the exchanges are accepting the fact that they're targets and are sort of like planning accordingly, like planning almost that there will be a failure. And I'll be honest with you, as a pragmatic person, I think this isn't necessarily a bad strategy. Well, as you said, Andrew, is like the guys who are doing this kind of stuff are quite sophisticated. Whatever defenses you're putting in place, they're looking for a way around it. They're becoming more creative with their social engineering to compromise and gain access to systems. They're looking at other ways through supply chains and various other things to try and break into exchanges and do damage. I think that they're very savvy in that these guys are going to continue to push us. When it happens, we need to know what we're doing, and I think that improvement in response is reflected. Does it mean they're not taking their security seriously enough? I think there's definitely there's a discussion to be had there. Okay, a couple of interesting things, and I think we'll talk a bit about tactics before we sort of like move into the next phase of this. If we go to the next poll, please. Something that we did as some analysis is we looked at the cryptocurrency hacks and scams, the number of incidents and what day of the week they took place on since 2011. And something that we've noticed is that Friday has the highest overall losses, generally speaking, and it has not necessarily the highest count of incidents. Andrew, why do you think that is?
I believe the main issue, one of the main issues, the first and the global issue that the hacker took their chances with whenever they have the ability to steal the funds. But the second issue that might be possible, from my perspective, is that usually on Fridays everybody are trying to relax, to chill, they are hiding their phones, and they might have the delay of getting the security alert, and it will be really complicated to get the attention of law enforcement, of the lawyers, because everybody usually having their off, they might be far away from their laptops, and it gives additional opportunity to launder the funds and to move
Yeah,
their
I agree.
yes for
I
different
think
sources.
And I think that's definitely something we've noticed in the large scale hacks of late. And I think, Bybit wipes out a lot of the data here. But one of the big points here is that the attackers love to work on a Friday. They'll set everything up because they know that the security teams might be on a reduced posture, the response teams are on a reduced posture. It's a lot more profitable to attack on a Friday. And certainly for a lot of the recent attacks by Lazarus, they've consisted on Fridays or national holidays. And again, it's just human nature they're taking advantage of. So I think if we were to relate that back to our earlier statement is okay, have exchanges got better at managing and handling incidents? Yes, they have. Are they taking security seriously? Do they build big enough walls on a weekend? Is everything ready to go for that sort of period? And I think, it could be said that if these guys are successful on a Friday afternoon or a Friday evening every single time, or they're looking for the reduced hours of these services, it's definitely a concern. The poll question that came up was, is law enforcement doing enough to tackle scams and fraud? A very difficult question. I think and we deliberately left it as a fairly binary choice, yes or no. I think overwhelmingly the response was no. There were some people who said they're doing everything they can, and I think it's a difficult question to try and answer. And we left it binary because he said, oh, they could do more, or they're doing just enough. I think this isn't. This is too easy for us to sort of run away and not necessarily stick a colours to a mast, but. Andrew, what's your take on that? Like, do you think that law enforcement is doing enough to tackle fraud with cryptocurrency, particularly?
I would say yes and no, just because I'm familiar with some law enforcement
Uh,
officers that are really good in terms of tracing the crypto and doing their work their best. But at the same time, I witnessed some cases when law enforcement had no idea what we were talking about when the case was related to the crypto. As especially it becomes more and more complicated right now during the DeFi era when most of the funds like moving through different DeFi protocols, there is a lot of layering processes uh, along the laundering process, and in general, it becomes really difficult and complicated to understand everything, and it becomes even more difficult to explain everything for an absolutely newbie police officer that is going to investigate this case. And yes, I believe that the education problem is quite crucial right now, especially because of the adoption of crypto. I really believe that the market is still going to grow and the adoption will grow as well. And there will be more and more crypto users and apparently more and more crypto cases related thefts and scams. And so far, we need more educated law enforcement to investigate these cases.
yeah, I think so too. I tend to agree that law enforcement, at the moment, in some jurisdictions, like it's very, very advanced, right? Like there's a lot more specific units set up to tackle cryptocurrency, but they're kind of, again, sort of like just as the criminals who steal money are, like these are big game hunters. They're looking at really big cases, really massive, complicated frauds and things like that. And I think it's the whole industry is geared towards supporting that kind of thing at a local level, and certainly we see it as investigations go on through Crystal and through the clients that we talk to. Many cases still take a long time through smaller or even local law enforcement because they're not familiar with the case, they're not familiar with technology, and they're not familiar with what they can do. And also inside that, the victim's also not familiar with what information they need to pass. And that seems to be something that's fairly commonly stated is that victims of cryptocurrency crime don't know what to pass on to the law enforcement officers or even private investigators for that matter in order to sort of get their case up and running and get moving, which again is another sort of like a big hurdle to this. So to sort of like look at our point on that is like, is law enforcement doing enough? I think there's a limit and what it can do, and I think that's it's a political issue rather than a specific one. Could it do more to improve the ability for individual people in those regions to understand the crimes and how to report them properly? I think there could be a lot more work done there. But it comes down to, getting some help from specialists. Another thing that we've noticed in fraud too is that fraud, it doesn't just affect, Western European, North American countries, like it's a global phenomenon. The scammers really don't care whose money they steal. They really, really don't care whatsoever. And I think frequently we've seen cases where money has been taken from places where their law enforcement has very little, if any, capability because the fraudsters are fully aware that, okay, they might not be the biggest payoff for them, but they are going to consistently make money from a place where they've not got a lot of recourse against them, which is a very concerning sort of trend given the sort of the social things that fraud and crime, and particularly financial crime, cause to communities. I just want to pick up on Ryan's point, saying that exchanges are getting better in their abilities, but when it comes to helping out, it's a patchy responses. And I think, to go back to the first poll question is like, okay, are regulators doing a good job or are regulators doing enough? I think this is where, I would be very interested to get your thoughts, Andrew. Like, do you think regulators should be pushing exchanges to be more cooperative with international requests? Or do you think it's something that comes down to, that we need to respect the established process of MLAT and things like that?
It's quite a good and at the same time complicated question, just because the regulation of the crypto market is something new that's going on right now. And the issue that we are having here is that the system is not transparent. For example, I had a case just a previous week when I was trying to log the account on the very big exchange, but I was not able to do that in 4 days just because I was collecting all the papers, all the evidences from the victim's perspective, just to make sure that everything is right and correct. Apparently, I was right in this particular case. Account was logged, but it took over 4 days just to make it real. At the same time, like it takes approximately a couple of minutes just to move the funds through the exchange, and I'm not even sure if there are any funds left on this exchange's account, but the process was still too long and complicated to deal with.
So we've got a multi-layered problem, right? We've got, as we said in the last poll, is like law enforcement, particularly at the local level. If you call like 911 or 999 or 112, whatever you phone for emergency services, help, my cryptocurrency's been stolen, help, I'm a victim of fraud. The process from collecting information to doing a tracing to then passing that information on to someone who can interdict it or do something like that is a many-step process. And that's before we start looking at international treaties and things like that. And it becomes a whole juggernaut of things to try and, to make things happen. It's funny, actually, I was on a panel last week and they had exactly the same sort of conversation. It's like, well, what do you do? This guy's lost money. You're kind of rolling the dice about whether or not you're going to get to an account where there's something left in it. And certainly something we've seen in or heard of in trends is that funds don't sit very long on exchanges. They've already lined up their mule accounts and they know the next steps that they're going to take once they've withdrawn the money. Andrew, like, how do you think we can speed this up? Like, what's a practical thing or practical piece of advice you can give to our audience about how can we speed up this process? Where does the work sort of start?
I recommend to everyone just to be prepared that you're not saved from the cases like that. And in case if you're going to be prepared, you need to have some kind of insurance. You need to have the access to the contact lists of the law enforcement officers that are might be related in for the investigation of this case in your jurisdiction. You should have lawyers prepared and advancedly high level experience in cases like this, and you should be aware about the processes that you're required to do. Just a small example, tiny example that I really like is the poison attacks for USDT users on Tron blockchain. Basically, the timestamp between the theft and the swap through the DeFi protocol of the stolen USDT to the TRX in some cases take just a couple of seconds, just because everything is automated. And yeah, it's not possible after the funds were swapped to the TRX to block them from the contract perspective. But in comparison with this, the best timeline, the best experience that I have with the Tether team, I absolutely realized that there are lots of processes, lots of complaints, and they have to be absolutely sure about what's going on. They need the law enforcement request to block the USDT via the contract, and so on and so forth. But again, the best and the fastest experience I had with the Tether team was a couple of days. So just a small comparison of a couple of seconds and a couple of days. And that's the reality that we have right now. We have speed up all the processes whenever we can and how we can, by being prepared for the cases, just making sure that you can do all your best if something happens with your funds.
Yeah, I definitely think definitely from a service provider's perspective, like if you're a crypto asset service provider or you provide consultancy services to them, like it's absolutely essential that you are prepared for this. Like part of your response plan or part of your like preparations As part of your information security audits, I'm sure you will have to do pen tests and do disaster recovery plans. You need to practice this. And as Andrew said, I completely agree. Like have, know who the lawyers are, know who the PR firms are, know who the private investigators are, know your contacts at law enforcement, be ready with the information and look at your local law enforcement. If they have a dedicated crypto team, make friends with them, get to know them, understand what they need to know, what they don't need to know. So it's not a question of a cold call when you start that conversation. And I think improving that public-private relationship, like having that dynamic between the guys who are near your regulators from the law enforcement perspective, will save countless hours. And as Andrew's rightly said, like we aren't dealing with huge amounts of time. Whenever we've talked about cryptocurrency crime, there's a lot of focus. Even in this report, we talk about like the amount of money, but the reality is the amount doesn't matter with crypto. The speed is the trick, right? Like it doesn't take days to process a transaction. In cryptocurrency, even if it's particularly large, finality can happen in literally, between 3 minutes to like, maybe like 45, like at maximum time. So it's really, really important that you are ready to move quickly when these things happen, and you know what you're going to go ahead and do with. So I think going back to our earlier poll question, are exchanges prepared? And are law enforcement doing enough? I think those two questions kind of tied together. It's like, are exchanges prepared enough? Are they taking it seriously? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Are law insurance taking up? Are law enforcement doing enough? Maybe they are, maybe aren't. I think there's a collective sort of focus on ensuring that all the information is gathered on one side and pushed so that people can do the other. And remember, from an exchange perspective, an industry perspective in crypto, we're talking to lawyers and police officers who don't necessarily speak the same technical language as we do. We need to make sure, we are speaking in words and terms that they understand, have legal meaning, and that will allow them to proceed with the case. If you go to them and say, "Oh, we've been a victim of, a phishing attack," they probably get what that means from other cases. But if you say, "Okay, we've had a massive theft," that's very direct. It's got legal meaning. They know what they need to do in those cases. It's a lot more straightforward, and it'll hopefully speed the process up as much as we physically can. And again, that's the trick that you need to sort of look at. Okay, I'm going to move on to like one more slide, and then we've got a couple of discussion questions. And that's generally speaking, like I think we talked about this slide before, but it's also the attack type distribution by value. And you can see that fraud represents a fairly small amount this year. Again, I think that's based on like weak data, if I'm really honest with you. Like I don't think we've got the full scope of fraud activity because there's just so much stuff that we can typify as fraud. When we look at fraud in Crystal, we're not necessarily talking about romance for investment frauds, so-called pig butchering and things like that. What we're really relating to there is large organized frauds or detective frauds. It's also very difficult for us to sort of like pin down a specific entity and say, "Oh, that's that." That would be a different report, and the values are significantly more significantly higher from that. But breaches tend to make up the highest thing. Notice too that DeFi has had a lot less of an incidence there too. But moving forward slightly from this, Andrii, what have you noticed in terms of our attackers? And I think, given the issues we are facing with data and gathering good data on this, what have you noticed about the attackers and their patterns over the past sort of 12 months? How have they changed? Because obviously we can see that the loss has gone up, but the number of attacks has gone down. How are the attackers responding to this? What are we seeing them in terms of changing in their tactics and things like that?
What exactly do you mean right now about the laundering mechanism?
Yeah, so we can see them stealing money. It happens less frequency, but there's large amounts of it. What do you notice about them in terms of changing their patterns of behavior?
Um, Basically, they started to use less mixers and more kind of legal services right now. Ones especially that do not collect strict KYC data. Just because after using mixers, your funds will still have these red signs on them, and there will be still questions about the source of the funds. Meanwhile, why do you have to use the mixers while you can use a couple of bridgers, couple of DeFi protocols just to swap the funds from one token to another? And to cash out them through some kind of OTC service that basically let you, without any kind of questions, to cash out millions of dollars or some kind of parkings in the middle of Europe. I even started to receive ads in my Facebook and Instagram regarding the anonymous cash out services in the middle of the Europe right now. And if you have opportunities like that, why do you have to use any kind of mixers? Why do you have to use any kind of license exchanges that collect these funds?
Mm.
And by the way, license exchanges unfortunately still in the middle of this pattern just because provide the liquidity for these OTC services. And most, not most, but many of these services are nested services on these license exchanges. Usually, I might be really happy during my investigation to see that my graph ended up on a license service. And you can see like, whoa, there should be KYC. They should receive the alert. They should stop this kind of transaction. But at the same time, like when you start to discuss with them about the details of this particular account, you realize that it is related to some kind of OTC services that funds were cash out. And when you start to negotiate about this particular case and transaction with the owner of this account, you realize that he has no information about this user, that the chat in the Telegram, for example, was deleted, and there is no info about this incident anymore and what happened with the funds further.
I think like moving forward, I think this is the direction that we as Crystal are going to take. A question that I asked myself, and I asked you as well last year, Andrii, and you've given me an answer today, which is fantastic, was we see all these numbers about scams and frauds, right? $21.3 billion. In some cases, the amount of money stolen is in excess of $1 billion. In many cases, it's in the tens and even hundreds of millions. Lots and lots of money is stolen. The problem here is when we focus on these numbers, we're forgetting about the end state, right? Like this is stealing money. Where does it go? And this is the missing link. And this is where we are trying to understand it. So our move forward from this point will be to look at the methodologies specifically that are being used. And as you heard the description then, and it's not subjective, like some of the work that we've looked at this is that attackers will still take the path of least resistance. They're not looking for a super complicated laundering route, even with the Bybit hackers, for example, the ones who successfully stole over $1.4 billion from, I think, the second or third largest exchange in the world on a Friday afternoon in February. I do remember it very, very well. I'm sure you do, Andrew, because we lost our whole weekend and about 3 weeks after that too, on my birthday. Thank you very much. Where they were able to compromise the custody of the exchange's Ethereum hot wallet and basically drain the entirety of their funds. And there are lots of things that have come out from the back of that. But the biggest view from our perspective is their laundering patterns don't really change a lot. And that says something is that the path of least resistance is still very, very effective. The use of some mixing services as intermediaries, the use of unlicensed or services that don't need KYC, and then the destination points, which is where we're trying to understand is that conversion layer. Like, where does that money come back into the licit financial system? When does it reappear? Because that's what we want to try and understand using the tools that we have available to us. And I will happily say that users of Crystal will have a very good idea about where the money is heading because we spent a significant amount of energy trying to understand those kind of laundering patterns. But Andrew, I have to ask you, like, it's always been like things in the community, and every investigator I've spoken to, like before Bybit hack was talking about Exchange X. They were talking about some of the DeFi protocols that were very popular. Years ago, we were talking about RenBTC, for example, right? We remember the Ronin hack and the amount of money that was brought through that particular bridge to the point where it nearly wiped out the liquidity pool. Like, why did it take so long for people to act against these services? If everyone, they kind of get a reputation in the community and we all start to see them in smaller cases, like, why does it take so long for something to happen or be brought against them, do you think?
Yeah, I guess the end of the run-in came up after the FTX case when they moved most of their funds through the run-in and haven't stopped, haven't collected any logs. The problem is, again, about the regulation. Just because this contract is basically the contract, it's a piece of the code, they just do some kind of function. You cannot, with the current regulation, to control it anymore, and there is no way to control it. But as far as I know, some law enforcement are going to do that, and there are already some frameworks in terms of collecting the data of their users for DeFi protocols as well, just because you cannot, in the modern world, conduct financial operations without asking the users about their data. You cannot exchange the funds and assist with the laundering of billions of dollars as for now. And from the modern cases, the Bybit case, for example, the amount of funds that moved through another DeFi protocol, the Third Chain, the third chain didn't stop anything as far as I'm aware. They didn't stop their operations at all in comparison with some other DeFi protocols. And they managed to earn during these swap and breach operations like millions of dollars as far as I remember. Just because Bybit Thief, Lazarus Group, they didn't care about the number of transactions and the amount of fees that they are going to pay. They apparently had enough resources for that. And they conducted thousands of transactions through this particular breach, and nobody was able to stop them in this particular moment. So yeah, as for now, it's not possible to regulate that, but I believe that market is moving toward this way just because you cannot just leave it like that.
I think too, like for me, it's like moving towards a responsible and compliant DeFi. I don't think, we didn't talk today about fraud particularly, but like obviously there's lots and lots of rug pulls happening in the meme coin space. I think there are so many cases that we would struggle to name like less than 10 in one sitting. I think a lot of the platforms that offer and allow the trading of meme coins at a very, very low level. Like it's not complicated to go on certain websites and set up yourself a meme coin and see what happens. But that's been abused quite a lot. Do you think that, if these services want to survive and want to grow their businesses, that they need to start acting in a more compliant manner because this could lead to not just regulatory penalty, but like a betrayal of consumer confidence. If your blockchain or your service becomes synonymous with illegal activity, it will put off legitimate users, even if it's still being used by, the bad guys. And I think, as you rightly said, like when we talk about RenBTC was a fairly popular protocol. It was one of the early cross-chain bridges, which allowed you to move, from Ethereum to BTC and back again, which had lots and lots of things. And we saw plenty of examples of legitimate users even using it for arbitrage, right? Like trying to make money on the price difference between, the Ren price and the exchange price of BTC and Ethereum and doing swaps like that. I think some of the last big transactions we saw activity on Ren before it was shuttered were like that. And it is it's an existential threat to the business. And I think, for people to build scalable long-term businesses, it's important to say, okay, well, we're not just doing this because the regulators have told us to. It's actually good financial sense. Because if your consumers become the target of, predatory people, or your service becomes exploited by, nation state money launderers who've stolen billions of dollars from the rest of the industry, it really damages your ability to interact. You're still going to get paid. You're still going to collect your fees cynically. You're still going to charge your transaction fees, but regular users are going to wash away, and you're going to be left with just a sea of undesirable characters who will get you in jail, basically. And I think that's, the way I look at it. So a question I get asked a lot too is like, oh, should we do DeFi regulation? Should we move towards a path where DeFi is regulated? My personal perspective is DeFi needs some level of regulation, but it doesn't need to, we're not going to drag you to it. You should ask for it because it's good business sense, because it protects your consumers, enhances your business reputation, and shows the world that you're not going to give a place for these guys to operate, because they're the ones who are going to screw your customers over. If your customers are investing in your platform and they lose all of their money, you're not getting any more money out of them. Like it's a very, very straightforward, business transaction from that perspective. Can we open the next question, please? And the next question is, do you expect the amount of money stolen to rise or fall? And you will notice, dear listeners, that we have not put it will stay about the same. You need to go one way or the other. I think, we tried to mull this over between myself and Andrii before we did this podcast today. And like we thought, well, if we just give you like the cop-out middle ground, then you're all going to run for it as fast as you can. So yeah, let's see. Money is going to rise or fall. There are lots of environmental factors, like we talked about a big sophisticated attack. We do see the number of incidents has fallen, but the value of incidents has gone up. So do you think the amount of money is going to go up or down? Andrii, do you have any thoughts on this question at all?
It's really complicated to predict things like that from my perspective, just because it everything could be fine, like birds may sing, like sun can shine, and then one day, just the case like Bybit will throw you back to the ground with $1.5 billion loss.
Yeah.
And I really doubt that anyone on the market could predict anything like that.
I sort of see it a different way, and I sort of see it as have we learned our lessons? That's the way I look at this, right? Because there were lessons from lots of cases. There were lessons in terms of like custody arrangements. How much funds do you have stored in a single wallet? Security arrangements, response arrangements, things like that. I think there's lots of factors in this question which you can sort of look at, and really, it's saying, are we going to get any better? um, at preventing theft. What's the results of the poll? Oh, okay. So more than half of you have voted to say it'll go up moderately or even significantly. I'd love to understand, Andrew. Some people said significantly. What do you think? I mean, again, you can click it in the chat section, but I'd really love to understand why people think it's going to significantly rise in terms of the amount of money that's stolen.
Mm,
What's your take on that? Is it just because Lazarus have got so sophisticated and so good at what they do? What do you think's going on there?
I might think about such results from the adoption perspective, just because the more crypto becomes popular, the more people are going to be involved into crypto, the more people are willing to buy some crypto to become a Bitcoin owner and stuff like that. And without the proper knowledge, without the knowledge of the other side of the cryptocurrency market, there will be much more cases related to the scams, related to the phishing and stuff like that, and the total number will grow. That's one
Mm.
of the possible perspectives.
And our final poll question then. Second, penultimate question, sorry. Can we have the next one, please? Over the next 12 months, do you expect the amount of money lost to fraud rising or falling? So, Ravi, you've posted in the chat that fraud will rise, and money laundering and counterterrorism finance will rise significant as regulators are approximately 10 years behind their technology. I tend to I tend to disagree slightly, and I say that is that regulators they've learned very, very quickly in many cases, like how to take on the technology, and they've gone almost from a standing start, and they've been led a lot by the industry. And I think regulators are now starting to form their own opinions on things rather than just take it directly from, what the exchanges are saying or what, the tool vendors are saying and things like that. They're starting to be a little bit more, savvy on the principles behind things rather than just taking our word for it. I think one of the big, issues with overall crime rising with cryptocurrency, as you said, Andrew, is adoption. The more places there are to take the money with cryptocurrency, the more opportunities you've got to convert it. Wow, a pretty solid response again. More than half of you have said that fraud will go up significantly. I'm intrigued. Some people said it would fall moderately in terms of fraud. Andrew, what do you think a driver of what could help make the number of fraud cases fall over the next 12 months?
Probably the education and regulation again.
Yeah, everyone's
Uh,
listened to our webinar. They've all worked out they need to have good training materials. All the law enforcement are going to get all over it, and we're going to suddenly see, the amount of money taken in fraud reduce because it doesn't pay off that much anymore.
yeah,
Maybe
the
in a
more
good way.
people will be aware that they shouldn't click the link that will double the amount of their Bitcoins in the next 24 hours, the less cases we'll have.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think people have got a lot more wise about the sort of the things that the ruses that are used. Although we do know with things like generative AI and deep fakes and things like that, the fraudsters have got sophisticated in other ways. A worrying trend that I've noticed, Andrew, over the past sort of few months is the sophistication of social engineering. There's obviously quite a few cases. Can you explain any cases recently that you saw with social engineering that were particularly significant to you?
I have a couple of cases that ring the bell from this year. For example, the one that occurred just in this August, just a couple of weeks ago, basically, and were related to the theft of over 780 Bitcoins. The cases like that are really complicated and they are really different from the Elon Musk doublers Bitcoins stuff. It involves like lots of data collection about the user, lots of information about his activity in the social media and so on and so forth. And usually they have a couple of layers of communication with victims like that. They start to fund their phone number from the Google accounts, from Google support, from the Coinbase support and stuff like that. They make the victim believe that something's going on with his funds, and they ask him to move them to some other place that it will be safer. But apparently it's not. And the sizes of cases like that are publicly available are 700 bitcoins, 3.5 thousand bitcoins from the April this year. And one of the biggest cases that I'm aware of that involved the Genesis case, it's called like that in public, and it took over 4,000 bitcoins.
So,
And
well,
in particular, this case was really interesting just because the thieves, the scammers, they had a stream of the theft, and because of that, it was possible to get them.
that's incredible. Okay, if we have like the final poll question then, please. So for both of the questions that we've asked you just now, what's the main action that you think can be taken that will cause the most disruption? Will it be stricter custodial regulations from exchanges, enforcement against online only unlicensed services that are used by criminals, high profile arrests, or consumer education training? You are allowed to select multiple choice. I would request you just to select one of them. I think that's just an error in the thing there. Because Crystal, we want you to put all your eggs in one basket. If there's one thing you're going to do tomorrow, and you could like click a magic button, and everything would get better for the environment, what would the one thing you would do? Andrii, I'm going to give that problem to you. What are you going to do to fix everything?
From my perspective, it's all about the regulation. Businesses
Okay.
are going to earn the money and do whatever they can to earn some additional pennies to their pocket. And until law enforcement are not aware about the issues that are going on the market right now, nothing is going to change.
Yeah.
You
I
can
mean,
yell a lot about the possible services that might launder the money for years, but until law enforcement are interested in this topic, I don't see the possible changes.
and I tend to agree. My view here is as well. My view is okay. It was broadly in line with what the panelists said. Sorry, the respondents said. Enforcement against services, and I think again it's another important one. Is regulation is one thing. Writing a set of rules down on a piece of paper and saying you must abide by this is definitely one way of combating this. But this is what affects the illicit market. The unlicensed or grey market doesn't care about your rules, and we know that. That's why they're so attractive to criminals for laundering funds. Enforcement against them is where the real power is. That's where you have the ability to shut down these intermediary services and make life difficult for the criminals. As we talked about earlier on in the webinar, it's all too often we see the same suspects, and any investigators in the chat now will happily turn around and say to you, how many cases did I have where all the funds went to Exchange X and I was never going to get a response from them because they just don't care. We all know it. It becomes like a quiet, hushed tone secret where we discuss these groups or these services. I think regulators need to act on them faster, and I think they need to make these services toxic to exchanges because they still rely on them for liquidity and counterparty trading. If we can make them toxic, it makes it very, very difficult for them. But to back that up, we also need to have enforcement against them. We need to see these services being shut down. We need to see them being confiscated. They're incredibly sophisticated technically. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think that is the most bang for your buck because a lot of the other stuff, it's kind of like sticking a plaster over, an amputated leg. Like it's not going to stop anything. Consumer education and training will certainly reduce the impacts. Okay, and we see we might see reduction in the number of incidents, but it'll only go so far. They'll still find a way through, and your training is only good as the last tactic that they used, right? We have to sort of plan against it. I also think like high profile arrests have a deterrent effect, but someone's always ready to take their place because there's lots of money involved. But pushing these middle services, making them either compliant, forcing them into regulation, or having serious consequences for them, which will then allow other services who they rely on for counterpart liquidity. And I think that's perhaps the hidden part of this, which is everyone talks about ExchangeX like they had no counterparties, like they received money from no exchanges, like they didn't have bulk orders or other services. They absolutely did. They rely on other services to provide them liquidity. It seemed like towards the end, most of their liquidity was the North Korean actors Lazarus, rather than perhaps illicit exchange. But licensed exchanges, they have, unfortunately, in some cases, relationships with these services. I think if there was more push on the exchanges to push back against them, that would certainly go some way to reducing them as opportunities. Andrii, like I'm going to summarize afterwards, but like, have you got any other summary points that you would want to sort of pass on to our audience here?
I will be eloquent. Be prepared,
Oh,
be educated, and look into the market trends. Just because the more prepared you are, the more faster and efficient reaction will be possible if something is going on with your funds.
as a true scout, you know the motto, which is to be prepared. Bear Grylls will be proud of you, Andrew. If you know who Bear Grylls is, look him up on Google. He's a fun guy. I think so. To sort of summarize, then I tend to agree with Andrew, and I think if you're from a VASP here, and you're looking at your compliance program, and you've got X amount of money under management, and security is always one of those things that no business wants to spend money on because it's kind of a sunk cost. You can tell them that it's very easy to lose your reputation very, very quickly if you aren't careful with it. Again, we always recognize that. So the first one is Andrew said, like, be prepared, be ready for what could happen. You don't live in denial that it won't. Don't be so sure that it can't happen to you because it can. I think the other thing too that I would like to remark on as well is like I think statistics in cryptocurrency criminal activity over time were useful benchmarks to see like the health of the industry and how it had responded to anti-money laundering or prevent fraud prevention. I think we're at a point now where the numerical values almost don't matter anymore. Like there's such vast amounts of money. $22 billion over 14 years is a significant amount of money. Really tiny, operating revenue for a business if you've got $22 billion. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what we do know. And nobody knows everything too. So I always get the impression, or I certainly feel that statistics are almost irrelevant. What's more important in this is identification of services that support and underpin this platform. What's the wiring? What's the mechanism? What's the logic and flows that are used, and who are those services, and what are the trends in them? As Andrew mentioned, mixing services have declined. They're still used for by some groups, but generally speaking, they're not that popular. We know that Tornado Cash, for example, fell out of favor whilst it was sanctioned with normal users, but it was still used a lot by the DPRK. And in fact, in some cases, so much money was pumped into the mixer, Tornado Cash and Ren BTC before them, that they were literally just withdrawing their own cash. Like they'd filled the bucket up with so much of their own money, they could only, pull out most of their own money because they were the liquidity for it. So, mixing services have problems, and that is that they're very visible, and the criminals know that they're visible, and they know that exchanges might stop a transaction or ask for additional source of funds and do all the right things which hinder them. But if there's an alternative path, which probably is going to be cheaper and even in some cases less visible, why am I going to go through that process? And what we think is more important for us now is to understand those tactics and specifically look at which services are the target and destination endpoints of that. Where are they located? Who's operating them? What are the trends that we're seeing in those kind of things? Why is it that DPRK specifically like to go along these type of exchanges or these type of services, or these particular, fraudsters like to go one place or another? What is it indicative of? And that's what we want to try and understand. So I think I shan't say now because I shan't speak for our content team, but I think, in terms of statistics, they're great, but also they don't really mean anything at this point in the game. We need to look more about the mechanisms that are supporting this rather than, how much money it's worth. And the final thing then is just to ask us questions. And, you might think you're prepared, but there's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion. If you have questions about your security arrangements, about your compliance arrangements, and whatever else, please feel free to reach out to Crystal directly. We are happy to sit and discuss and help you come up with ways of getting those plans. And as a very bare minimum, sit down, work out who the points of contact are in your regulator, in your local law enforcement, and at the major exchanges if something goes wrong, so you've got someone to flag it up to, because they can also provide you some assistance. When Bybit happened, competitor organizations pulled in. We saw collaboration between blockchain analytics companies. We saw collaboration between major exchanges. Everyone pitched in, and it was a very, very good example of how to mitigate a crisis. But I've only seen it once since, and I'd like to see it a lot more. And I think for everybody in this space, I think that'd be ideal. That's the outcome we want to see on every single case. But that comes down to Bybit being organized and ready to go, but everyone else learning the lessons from them. Again, we can learn technical lessons, we can improve security, we can all do better when it comes to incident response. I think that's everything for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this panel. I know we've tried to look at the numbers and tried to sort of make sense of them, but again, as I mentioned on the conclusion, then the numbers almost don't mean anything at this point. They're going to steal money. It's going to go up. It's going to go down. What's important is understanding where it's going, what the services that underpin it, and how are they supporting it. And that's our next phase of research. I gave Andrew a question last year. It wasn't one of his OKRs or one of his professional reporting goals. I didn't write it on his review statement, like, has he answered my question? But the question I gave was, where is this money going? And that's definitely our destination. I don't accept the term funds have gone dark anymore. They're somewhere, but where? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.